Your Serene Highness, thank you once again for being here. I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us and inviting us to your home. Matter of curiosity to start, I'm British, and in the UK I've grown up with a queen for as long as I can remember, and before that my grandma probably remembers the king, and it's always been the head of the monarchy has been a king or a queen. Why in Liechtenstein, you're the head of state, but you're a prince? Why?
Because we have been a principality in the Holy Roman Empire. Together now, I think what was left over of the Holy Roman Empire is Monaco and Andorra. So we kept our principality. To change the name would have been a nuisance.
Yeah, hundreds of years of history, I suppose.
Yes.
And is there a difference other than in name between, the UK, which is a kingdom, and Liechtenstein, which is a principality?
Well, if I look at the map, I see the kingdoms are usually much larger than the small principalities.
That's true. Certainly Monaco, Liechtenstein, smaller than
That's right.
even the UK, which is perhaps quite small in itself.
But still. Yes.
But still.
Compared to Liechtenstein. But we are compared to Monaco nearly 100 times as large.
Yes, Monaco. I went to Monaco many years ago. For half a day, I did a big train trip around Europe, and I stopped in very much a city-state rather than... We were talking to a man who represents your tourism office yesterday, and he was saying how there are 3 Liechtensteinian dialects. Is that the right word to use?
Yeah, that's right. 3 dialects, basically.
Yeah, for such a small country, 40,000 people, it's interesting. Such diversity in such a small place, whereas Monaco, very much a city by the sea, and yeah, fascinating for me. So thank you. So a lot of what we wanted to talk about today was your book, The State in the Third Millennium, which I think we've got a lot of questions around that. But one thing we were all talking for the cameras when I talk about we, it's me and my partners here. We really like the quote, and I'll just read it because, it's your quote, but just so I don't screw it up. Ask not what a citizen can do for the state, but rather what the state can do for the citizen better than any other organization. And obviously, I don't know if you intended it to be a take on the famous JFK quote about ask not what your country can do for you, but for what you can do for your country. Maybe. I was wondering if, as a way to kind of an introduction to your book, I suppose, can you tell me a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, of course, I was influenced by John F. Kennedy. I had the pleasure to meet him personally in the White House when I was an intern in the American Senate. It was in the 60s, and I had to think quite a lot about what's the future of those small states like the Principality of Liechtenstein and monarchy. And I came to the conclusion, as I studied then afterwards economics in St. Gallen, that basically the state should be a service company. Serve the people and not serve an ideology or religion or God knows what, or a small elite of people who enrich themselves on the back of the citizens. So I thought that would be necessary. It should be a service company, basically.
And is this something you came back with and implemented in Liechtenstein?
Yeah, I would not have been able to implement it when I came back from either the US or from my studies in universities, but I knew that there was a conflict building up somehow, still under my father, about the future of the monarchy, the future of this small state, this mini state. And so I thought when I would then take over, basically, I had already a lot of ideas on how to change it and to turn the state much more into a service company with the right of self-determination in every village we have 11 villages. So that was the idea which I thought about quite early on.
Yeah, and it seems we've visited several villages here, and we met with a couple of members of parliament this morning, talking about the referendum system, which is something I'd love to get into a little later on, and how tightly that relates to self-determination and all of those things. You mentioned there about the place of small states or mini states in the world today, because we've often seen, over the last however many decades, or perhaps the better part of a century, countries that are very large, United States being a great example, perhaps China becoming an increasingly good example of, leading the globalization process. But, Liechtenstein and if I can, there was recent papers that were published by Credit Suisse about small states, and we found it interesting that these papers kind of said smaller states have achieved better results, both not just economically but socially for their citizens as well. Kind of bringing it to the present day a little, and over your reign, what do you think the competitive advantage of smaller states like Liechtenstein are today?
I think the competitive advantage what we have is that the government, and with it also the reigning prince and the parliament, are much nearer to the problems and sometimes also nearer to the solutions. And I remember a chief of government of the 50s who was an outstanding personality. He was, in fact, my best man in our marriage because we respected him very much. And I remember there was a visit of, I think, the German chancellor in the 50s or 60s, beginning of 60s. And he said, oh, well, you're such a small country. How are you going to survive? There's now integration of Western Europe and so on. And he said, oh, how can you solve your problems, And his answer was not very diplomatic. He said, we always notice our problems earlier than you notice your problems, and we solve our problems before we even notice that you have a problem. And that quietened the German chancellor. I think it was basically correct.
It's funny you mentioned that. You're the third person. We met with a chap from the business office. We met with the MPs, and we're meeting with you. And one theme throughout has been, especially the MPs, I think, was if someone has a problem and you're doing something they don't like, it's quite small. They can be like, hey, excuse me. It's because you're so close. The power is so close to the people that it's... And then also,
they would call me up on the telephone, and not me anymore, but my eldest son.
Absolutely.
And then we discuss it and look, can we solve the problem? And then it gets solved.
This is, we've only been here a day, but it's been interesting to see how well this works here. And talking to the members of parliament about, that being one of the many checks and balances that keeps Liechtenstein and, the people having that right to self-determine, the right to take up issues with their leaders. Do you think, this works fantastically here, but in a country as large as the United States, the UK, Spain, do you think this is, that right to self-sovereignty and that right that works so well here in a small country, do you think that can work in the constitution of a much larger country?
Yes, I think yes. I've seen it in Switzerland. Yeah. They have it. They have this direct democracy. They have this decentralization, sometimes depending on the canton, down to the small villages. I've seen it to a certain degree also in the United States. Of course, there from state to state, it's a little bit different. But that influenced me very much, and I thought, that's basically a good system, and to give the people some say, because usually, especially in the very centralized states, as a politician or as a monarch, being now a monarch or president or prime minister, it takes so long until you realize that there is a problem. Yeah. And with that, problems pop up, and suddenly you see, oh, I didn't realize that. They suddenly have an initiative, being locally, being on statewide level. And then you can solve those problems much earlier.
So do you think if the United States running as an example, how, there's so many states, and even though they're quite large in themselves, they will have a governor of each state, and then people will elect that governor, and then even that is closer to the people. Do you think there could be a system of more direct democracy where there's, you're never going to be able to ask the president about your problem because there's 300 million people who've got issues, and probably not even your governor. I mean, however many people live in California, I know it's like larger than most European countries. Yeah. But do you think if we took it all the way down and had, that kind of relationship that you see in Liechtenstein with the MPs and the people, if a system like that could be implemented across, and then so you have kind of layers that worked efficiently up to the point where the power rests?
Yes, I think so.
It's an interesting idea.
I saw it also, to come back to my time when I was an intern at the US Senate. The senator was from Rhode Island, one of the smallest states. And there you could see how easy it was basically for the people to contact him. Mm-hmm. For the larger state, it was more difficult. But I think this decentralization and this also close connection to a certain degree in the United States between the politicians and the people, which is, I think, in many respect closer than in most big European states, despite the fact that they are much smaller. Mm. That, I think, has led to a situation where the American system has turned out to be much more stable than many European and non-European states.
Speaking of stability, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to ask about stability of the country related to self-determination, especially here in Liechtenstein. Yeah. There's this, as we've discussed with members of parliament, with the chap we met from the business office, it's, 1,000, is it 1,000 signatures can be raised and then a referendum can be put forward?
That's right, for law and for a change of the constitution, or it would be 1,500 if I remember correctly.
Okay. And Liechtenstein, for reference, about 40,000 people. Yeah. So you go out there, you can gather these things. It's interesting because I feel this should be something that you're like, if I can get 1,000 of my friends together and then put something forward and then Parliament have to discuss it, and if it's quite a smart idea, a constitutional change at 1,500 could happen, which, prima facie, you think, this is going to be less stable, right? The immediate thought that comes into the mind, because anyone can change this right away. But this doesn't happen here, and it doesn't seem to happen in other places that have a similar thing. Why do you think that is?
Because many of those things are discussed on a local basis. And you have people who are in favor of it, who are against it, and so on. Those things are much more discussed within the population, within the voting, within the voters. And I think that has turned out to be an advantage. Added to the stability, if I look at Switzerland, for instance, nevertheless, I think that we have even a better system than the Swiss, with the possibility of a veto power by the reigning prince.
Yes. Just to clarify, the Swiss system, they also have a similar system of direct democracy, but obviously, prince to veto it. How do you, it's interesting to ask you yourself, how do you feel that veto power helps protect, or do you think it helps protect democracy? And if it does, how?
What I've seen when I analyzed the whole situation in Switzerland, I was in favor to enlarging the direct democracy in Liechtenstein. So I started an initiative on that, collected some signatures, because parliament and government was not so much in favor of that. So,
sorry, in Switzerland or here?
Here,
yeah.
Here,
sorry,
yeah. But I thought that it would be worthwhile to keep the veto power of the reigning prince, except for an initiative where the people want to abolish the monarchy. Because I saw that sometimes you had in Switzerland votes which were perhaps not in the long-term interest of the country or of the people.
Definitely a theme with politics, the short-term interests winning out.
Yeah, and there I thought, especially in foreign policy, I saw it also here in Liechtenstein, the reigning prince, we think in generations. The people think, or the politicians think from one election to the other. So this mixture is not that bad. Yeah.
If I could just say, I mean, I recently was reading it might have been an article or a book or maybe a YouTube video these days, about someone was commenting about the benefits of, and I don't want to relate this to you in any way because it's not, about if you have a dictator. Yeah. The dictator thinks generationally. He thinks, where's my country going to be in 100 years? But obviously, if you've got a dictator, things tend to go sour pretty quickly. But when you balance things, and when you balance it right, like you say, you really get the benefits of both. You get the democracy, you get a happy populace, and in Liechtenstein, I mean, those Credit Suisse papers about the economic and social benefits of success of smaller states, exemplified by Liechtenstein. Highest GDP per capita in the world, social health programs. It's doing well, we could say. Yes. So a great example of how those two things have led to that, and I appreciate you tactfully answering because it's an interesting thing, self-determination and stability. But it's easy to see why it works when you think beyond the surface of.
You have always, of course, the risk that a reigning prince or monarch might misbehave, and that's something which I also introduced. We had I finally, after 200 years, I was able to change our family constitution, which was not that easy because even every voting member of the family, because the family constitution dated back to 1600, and every male member had a veto power. So every attempt to change it was nearly impossible. But anyhow, I managed somehow to change it. And that gives now the family also to remove a reigning prince from his office if he doesn't behave well.
Ah, another check and balance.
Check and balance, very important.
Yes. Do you mind if I ask you, the family constitution, that's different from Liechtenstein's constitution?
That's right.
Can I ask what it is?
Yeah, we have a family constitution. We had an old one going back into the Middle Ages. That was something in the noble families of the Holy Roman Empire, the reigning princes. They had some kind of family constitution. That was changed in 1604. Family was very small, or 1606, something like this. And every male member had a veto power. And that turned out to be really a difficulty to adapt it. So over the last 200 years, every reigning prince more or less tried to change it. Because nobody really knew, because there were some changes and nobody knew, is this change in force or not in force? It was a complete mess. So I did the following after my father failed. When he passed away and I took over, I said, okay, I work out a new family constitution. And I called in all the voting members of the family, including their wives, because I thought it would get some support there too, if informal.
Very tactful.
And I said, okay, now you have two choices.
Yeah.
It was my brothers and my sons and a number of other male family members have agreed on this new constitution, which we can finally publish here, because that was also something what the politicians, we don't even know what the family constitution looked like. We should publish it. We couldn't publish it because nobody knew about it. What's in force and not in force. So like, okay, you have now two choices. Either you agree or don't vote against it. If one single member votes against it, no problem from our side. We are going to have a new family community you will live with the old constitution. You are not anymore a member of our family.
Apply a little pressure, yeah.
And that solved the problem. We had abstentions, but nobody would vote against it.
It seems a very tactful way. Vote for it or don't vote.
Yeah.
Nice. If we could move on a little bit, we talked a bit about Liechtenstein's economic success and your time. You mentioned back meeting JFK and the ideas for where's royalty's place in a smaller state and in the world at large. Related to that, I have to say I kind of know the answer to the question, but I'd love to hear your take on it. So as I mentioned, Liechtenstein, by various measures, the highest GDP per capita in the world. So a very, very wealthy country. And, we've been walking around and it's reflected in, beautifully clean streets, just a lovely looking place. But it wasn't always like this, was it? It was quite different. I think I read kind of agrarian was the term. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of Liechtenstein kind of before its relatively recent economic success?
Well, one of my predecessors around 1700 bought the governing rights of those. There were 2 counties in the Holy Roman Empire. It was basically a vote-buying exercise because you voted the emperor. And so for him to get more influence in the Holy Roman Empire as a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, he bought those voting rights because it was very poor and the families who were reigning then always went bankrupt. He could, of course, support by his huge estates, there was no problem, those 2 counties and put them together, made the principality out of it.
So if he buys the land because the possession of the land is what gives him the voting rights.
Not really the possession of the land, but it was the reigning powers over the land.
Okay, so
the land would still be partly in private ownership. That was separated. It was some kind of private. He would bought some counties. There were counts here who went bankrupt, and to pay for the people who they owed money. Then there was a court in the Holy Roman Empire where they just sort of auctioned it off the governing rights. And my predecessor, in the 17th century, was very rich. And he paid the highest price for that.
So it wasn't, in a way, there was still private land ownership. It was he was buying the governing rights over what is today Liechtenstein, yes?
Yeah. Nobody was really interested here in the land. The first one to move here to Liechtenstein was my father in 1938. Yeah. And the first one to visit what one of his ancestors, predecessor, bought, he came there, I think, when a railway was built throughout Austria, sometimes in the middle of the 19th century. So hundreds of years later.
Now I can go visit this land that I've purchased a long time ago.
Yeah, what's that?
Yeah.
Of course, they nominated someone to represent them, and they paid for the people. They introduced reforms. They paid for the education of people. We were one of the first countries to introduce more or less free education or education on a statewide basis. So yeah, one tried to develop it.
Yeah. So it existed at that point. You said your father was the first one to move here. Why? What changed? Was it some around the time of the war, or what caused you to move back here?
Well, basically the family lived on their huge estates, what is now the Czech Republic, and or their palaces in Vienna. Mm-hmm. There was some estates in Austria still. But then when Hitler took over Austria, one didn't know what would happen with Liechtenstein. And when the German troops marched into Austria, my father, who was not yet the reigning prince, his great uncle was married to a Jewish baroness. So the family was very much anti-Nazi, as you can imagine.
Yes, you were married to a baroness, yeah. Probably not Hitler's best friend.
No. The reigning prince fled to Czechoslovakia over the border, and my father drove to Liechtenstein with his car, met the German troops marching towards Vienna, and tried to stabilize it here.
Yeah.
And luckily he succeeded, that we were not annexed. There was a small attempt of a coup d'etat here in Liechtenstein by a Nazi party.
Yes.
When my father, I think in 1938, just before the outbreak of World War II, the small Nazi party, by the support of some Nazi people outside, I think the governor of Tyrol and Vorarlberg or southern Germany supported, they tried to make a march on Vaduz, like the March on Rome by the Duce. And
wow.
So it was a bad copy.
Yeah. Bold.
Bold.
Yeah.
But then the people heard about it. When they start to march, of course, you couldn't keep it secret. So the people came together, the farmers at that time, with all their instruments, the forks and all
pitchforks,
pitchforks and so on. They surrounded them.
So we're not having any
kicked
of this.
them out of the country.
Wow.
So that failed.
Fascinating. Your father was here, and he established what exists today, essentially.
That's right. When the reigning princes came to visit before, they built a villa up here, but they came very seldom, and it was only built in the second half of the 19th century when the first one came to visit. But then the people wanted to have the castle, which was before a museum, adapted so that it would be the residence of the reigning prince.
And this is where we are.
And that's where we are. So my father put in central heating, electricity, telephone, God knows, a kitchen and so on. Luckily, it was ready when he married, just in time. Few months before he married, everything was ready.
You got to have central heating, kitchens, all of these things. Related to the economy of Liechtenstein, and I appreciate the history, things I didn't even know after doing the research for all of this. What kind of drove the change from the agrarian Liechtenstein, from I suppose how it was before your father arrived and set things up here, to Liechtenstein as it is today? Because while it was 60 years, 70 years, it's in a way that seems like a lot of time, but in a way it's not a lot of time for such a dramatic transformation.
I think there were several factors which were important. One factor was already in the 19th century when one of my predecessors introduced general schooling. We were one of the first states to introduce it, I think worldwide, I think in Europe. Because I thought, because it was a poor country, relying on the subsidies of the reigning princes, so at least we should educate the people so they can find a job outside of Liechtenstein if they don't find one inside.
Yeah.
One kept the taxation as low as possible, so to attract business. One was then able to make a the customs treaty with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Yeah. That opened up the big market. Before, for the local market, hopeless.
Right, very small.
It was too small. So with the access to this large market, one could attract the Swiss textile industry.
Yeah.
Because it were across the border, but next to it, but there was a free trade with that. Otherwise, they would have had to pay taxes.
I'm just thinking of the similarities with today, kind of how in the past we're a very small country, we want to trade with Austria-Hungary, and now it's like European Union. Yeah. In a way, a similar thing. You have your small country, and we saw Hilti, the tool manufacturers, the dental stuff, of course, low taxation, which is something we'll discuss in a bit. People, I think, often have these notions where they think of something and they're like, why is a place rich? And use Switzerland rather than Liechtenstein as an example. Low taxes, right? But the reality is it's often more than that, whether it's education, an education of the people as well.
Education, very important.
Yeah.
And then also access to the markets.
Yeah.
If you don't have access to markets, we couldn't even feed our own people. They were dependent on subsidies by the reigning prince. And of course, it became better it was fine with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then after it collapsed, luckily we got the same treaty with Switzerland. And I was able to push through, thanks to direct democracy, the European economic market, because there was a lot of resistance in government and parliament. I would not have got through that. But with direct democracy, I was able to put it into a popular vote.
Yeah.
So I got it through.
It's in what we were talking about earlier, those benefits of having two parallel systems. How you can say, if this isn't working here, let me have a try over here, and thinking about the greater good and the long-term future of a country rather than something, which we often see in politics, maybe especially today. I'm not sure about in history, but of, populism and stuff like that. What's popular today rather than what's good for us or good for a nation over the long term. Which
I can understand, because for a politician, he has to win the next votes. And that's always a short-term thing. 4 years, 6 years, perhaps.
Yeah.
The most.
In a way, it's not the politicians. It's the system that's
It's the system which produces it up.
Yeah, I was recently hearing about how President Trump, how his first day in office, he immediately began preparing for 2020. What is the thing?
Yeah, his re-election.
Yeah, he already started fundraising. He was like, I just got it, but we got to start thinking about the next one because I want 8 years. But yeah, it's short-termism, I suppose. Yeah. We spoke a little there about low taxation, and I think one of those things people think about when they think of Liechtenstein, probably incorrectly, because only 23% of the economy, I believe, currently is financial. So that leaves a large amount. I think we've mentioned in this video up until this point for the cameras, but it's dental, tools, a lot outside. But do you think that the removal of the secret banking that was here before, do you think that affected Liechtenstein's economy much?
Well, it reduced for short terms tax income, but against my more pessimistic look at it, I was very much in favor of opening it up because it exposes so much criticism. None of those banks or the financial industry, they recovered after 2-3 years. Perhaps also because I always said we are not going to be able to uphold this banking secrecy, which was introduced sometime before World War II by the Swiss and so on. So that's changing. So you have really to if you want to survive in the long term as a bank or in the financial industry, you have to offer good service for people who are willing to pay also their taxes in their home country.
I think that's another thing that I picked up on was with these smaller states, you can really focus on, instead of, like you say, the reality is this is the way the world's going. People need to be open with their finances. This is how it's going to be. And then you could switch to a focus on let's do really good banking. Yeah. Let's be really excellent banks. Let's not be, generic giant bank who won't pick up the phone on Saturday morning to let's be really good at this, which is
important.
Do you think that's another one of the reasons why, Liechtenstein as an economy has done so well, because you can focus on doing things really well rather than...
I think so, yes. I think it was the education system, it was the low taxation, it was the realization that you would only be able to survive in a small, as a small country in an economy with no home market. You had to compete on the world markets to survive. and nobody's going to protect you. The government cannot afford to support one of our larger manufacturing companies. We just, then we would have to raise taxes, and there would be immediately an initiative by the people in the popular vote. Why should we pay more taxes to support Mr. Ospelt, Mr. Hilti, Mr. Meyer, Mr. whatever, Müller?
This is why I like your system, because like, I feel this sometimes happens in other countries, maybe my own. And we don't really get a say. It's like, yeah, we just gave them loads of money because they were in trouble. Anyway, for better or for worse. I'd like to move on a little bit, because I realize we're talking quite a bit, and I did want to talk more about the idea of the state as the service provider. I could try and describe it myself and fumble around, but you wrote a book on it. What do you mean? It's a really broad question, but what do you mean by the state as a service provider? I know we talked a little bit about it, but
I think the state should really concentrate on those jobs which the state can do better than private industry, or better than the local communities. And for me, it was also important when I proposed those changes of the constitution to also introduce the right of self-determination. That every village in Liechtenstein has the right to leave Liechtenstein, the principality, if they think that they get a better offer from another country, or if they can make more money or lower taxation or God knows what if they become independent. And that was for me also important, also for my successors and for the politicians to see really to deliver a very good service on low cost, and therefore low cost with low taxation.
Do you think that lower cost is driven by competition?
Yeah.
Between, because my understanding is the local governments of Liechtenstein, as you know, they have a lot of self-determination. They're also competing with each other. Is that, could you tell me a little how that works?
Yeah, the different, well, we have 11 villages basically. They compete on taxation. They compete on the way how they offer their infrastructure. For instance, if they give building sites to some industry, God knows what. So there is a certain competition that the services or whatever. So they compete on these issues basically.
So if I was a Liechtensteinian and I was living here and I was looking at 11 different villages, I feel, again, relating it to my experience, I basically have like one country where I grew up, so I'm always going to relate things to the UK. But I think about it, if I grew up in a village called Headcorn, and if I go to the next village over, or town, or Canterbury or whatever, I get pretty much the same deal. It's not going to be any different, whether I'm working for someone or starting a business or applying to the government for a permit to do something. It's always going to be the same. But here in Liechtenstein, if I can look at what the different villages are offering and make a decision.
Yeah. Some villages said, "Oh, we have now enough manufacturing industry," or also enough foreigners. That was also quite an issue. And because if you attract, being the service industry, the manufacturing industry, with it you attract also workforce also from outside, because we cannot provide all the workforce here, not the specialists and so on. So basically, there was then a resistance. No, we have to stop. And others took up the chances and were able then to attract manufacturing or service industries, and therefore get more income for the village, and then offer, I don't know, lower taxation, or build a new road, or a new school, or renovate a church, or God knows whatever ideas they had.
It's a really interesting concept, and clearly one that works. You mentioned there about, the issue of foreigners, and I'm quite interested in the immigration policy on Liechtenstein. We were talking to a guy yesterday who was Swiss. I believe his parents became residents here or citizens here, and then he did as well. He's very passionately a Liechtensteiner. Liechtensteiner. Thank you.
Yeah.
I knew I would screw that up, but I didn't. So good. So while Liechtenstein in many ways, encourages that international trade, you've got big companies here, you're trading with the European Union before that, like we were talking about Austro-Hungary. Still, from talking to this guy, Liechtenstein, I think he said he had to live here, or he would have had to live here. Or I think he was saying if we wanted to become Liechtensteiners, it would be 20 years here, or marriage, or referendum. You can get people to vote on you. 1,000, which was,
very much so.
In an interesting way, I think he was saying he'd had two people, he'd received their papers, and it's there's a photo of him, what are his hobbies, a kind of social CV in a way, about a social media profile in a way, and people got to vote on it. Both of these guys, they were yeah, they seem good, they're into the things we do here. I think, it was an argument against this, which again, you see a lot of in other countries, where it's you can be pro or anti-immigration, but I think what people generally agree on, wherever you are on that debate, is you don't want these communities to be insular within a country. And I think that was a big part of what he was talking about. Yeah. But in general, Liechtenstein's quite restrictive on immigration. Yeah. And I was wondering with, the competition and this kind of generally libertarian ideas, immigration's also often bundled in with that. I was kind of wondering why Liechtenstein is more restrictive on immigration.
Well, we still have over 1/3 of foreigners. Despite having given the citizenship to a number of people who were looked at being foreigners in their village, especially in smaller villages, they remember that your father or grandfather or great-grandfather immigrated, still look at you it's not a completely citizens of our village, even if you would move from one village to the other, because with being a villager, you also had some rights on land owned by the village, basically. So they didn't want to share it with some newcomers. So that sort of restricted the integration of foreigners, even if they would just move from one Liechtenstein village to the next. So there we were able to liberalize it, but it was like this, that we had to make compromise. And so also Switzerland had this problem that too many foreigners would move in, and we had it even before that. And then we put in some restrictions, made some compromises that people who have lived for a longer time here or several generations, they would automatically get the citizenship and so on. So that was always kind of compromising. And we have to restrict it because with low taxation, highest per capita income, we would have a tremendous inflow of foreigners into Liechtenstein, and we would have, instead of, 40,000 people, have 400,000 people. And that was also resented because especially the rich people moved in before we put in those restrictions because of the low taxation. They would buy nice houses, nice building places, whereas the local people couldn't afford it. Yeah. And so that built up a lot of resentment, and we had to do something. Yeah.
It's interesting to see how from both sides you have people who would they'd see highest income per capita and all of this stuff and be like, I want to move there. And then right on the other side of the spectrum, here's some incredibly wealthy guy and he's like, I want to move there because of the low taxation. So immigration on both sides, everyone loves Liechtenstein. In relation to the labor markets, because something often seen when you have a restrictive policy on immigration is, skills, people who have, very specific skills. Yeah. Do you feel that this is something that inhibits Liechtenstein's economy in a way because it's harder for someone who brings a very hard skill to come in?
No, Basically, the government, and we also tried to sell it, that we will let in those people who have high qualifications, which would add something to the economy, which don't have to be supported by the community because they don't earn enough money. So this kind of thing, one agreed on a certain number of people with some priorities. So we put up a system similar to Switzerland. Switzerland had faced the same issue a little bit later than us, and they introduced a similar system too. One thing was also, with this restriction, we forced our companies to expand abroad. That was important. No cheap labor. We don't let in cheap labor. So they had to move those jobs outside. And that supported a lot the economy here, because we were able to concentrate more on the high value added products or services, the research, the management, these kind of things. And that certainly helped to push up the per capita income and to move the cheaper jobs outside in low-income countries, where you would also support the local economy with factories.
And I think also when you have something like that, say manufacturing, a country like Liechtenstein, which is small, if you have a high, you need lots of people working, who aren't highly skilled, doing a job. It's hard for that to work in a country like Liechtenstein.
Yeah, I think, and I think it improved also the economy, but also in those countries too, they were happy to have new factories there, and also to work on the local markets. Our largest company is the Hilti company. And they are worldwide. I remember still when the old founder of Hilti was furious that one restricted his import of rather low qualified people. He couldn't grow, but that forced him to grow outside, and he became a worldwide company because, to a certain degree, the restrictions we had here.
It's interesting, companies find a way, and when you provide the incentive to do something, they'll go do it. I wanted to ask a question more related to politics rather than economy, so a little bit of a change of direction, if you don't mind. Referendums. I think I'm, with Brexit and my Spanish friends here with Catalonia. Whatever our opinions on such things, something that always comes up in these, especially maybe Brexit, again, going back to my knowledge of a country, is informed decisions. Referendums, they often are, with Brexit, it was like you just had the people who wanted to leave calling the people who wanted to stay, calling the people who wanted to leave dumb. And it was kind of this ongoing theme. In relation to that, how do you think, in a country that has so many referendums, that people can make informed decisions?
There are two things which you have to take into account before you introduce it. One is that you have to start on a local basis, that people really get trained in those kind of direct democracy, referendums, initiatives, and so on, where they can see what's the effect of a stupid decision on the village, on the city, whatever. So that, I think, is one aspect. The other aspect is that you have to inform the people quite a lot. We have in the law, and also Switzerland, that there's a duty to inform, give all the information, to have enough time for the people to, before a vote, discussions and so on. So that's very important, and you have to hand out all the information on a neutral basis.
I wanted to ask about that because it seems often the information, at least I've seen, is handed out by whichever newspaper you tend to subscribe to. How is that neutral information disseminated to the population?
government or the village administration, if it's just only a local vote, has to hand out the information, neutral information, where both sides can put this information there. Then they can also put their own view into there. So that's handed out to all the voters. So they can look it up. They organize meetings and so on. So before such a vote, it's really, I think the people are well informed. Yeah.
Those, I don't know, whenever I tend to read stuff written by a government, it's, I don't know, I think of myself as reasonably intelligent. And I read some of this stuff and I'm like, like governments can be verbose and they're not perhaps the best at writing things in an easy to understand way. Is this information presented in a way that, you know, it doesn't require a degree to understand? It's kind of like, here's how it is for the everyman.
It's in your own interest. If you read it in a stupid way or in a way which nobody understands, it's going to be rejected.
Right. The people writing this.
Yeah. Of course, you have to check that they write it in a correct way, and you can appeal to that to the courts. So if there is wrong information in there,
courts would solve that. Cool. Separation of powers. Very nice.
Yeah, very important.
Thank you. I like the idea of referendums. It's just people need to be informed, and this, I think, it's. Yeah. I was interested to know how you did that, and this seems like a.
And I think it somehow gives a more stability to a country and to the political system. If the people are much more involved, it's not only those up there in the castle or wherever they are.
Absolutely, yeah.
But they are the ones who took the decisions to a large extent.
And I've seen this talking to you today, talking to the other people I've talked to here. People feel involved. They feel like they meet their politicians on the street. They, you do your, there's a name for it, where you meet the people of the city of Liechtenstein in the palace every year, and they can come.
Yeah, in the garden when we have our national day.
National Day.
National
in August,
Day.
Right?
What?
In August.
In August, yeah. It was the origin was. It's on the 15th of August. And it was when my father moved here and we were suddenly neighbor of the Third Reich. And the Third Reich, the day of the Führer was a national holiday. There was big celebrations. And one said, okay, we want to show those across the border that we have our own Führer, and that's birthday not of the Führer in Germany, but the Führer of Liechtenstein.
Yeah. That's how it started?
That's how it started.
As a kind of, I won't say it, but like to the Nazis. Like.
To the Nazis, yeah. And then one started also a big firework, you know, when the bombing started. The border, yeah. So there was all illuminated and everything, and that's different. And they could see from across the border, from the Third Reich, they would come and see, here we have fireworks, there they have to turn down the lights because they are afraid of being bombed. And so that was to show that
we can do it too, and we can do it better.
We can do it.
Fantastic. Le Pen, Trump, UKIP. Why now? Do you have an opinion on why do you think this is happening now?
We see changes in the whole system of indirect democracy. People get more detached. Everything has become more complicated. You have globalization. There's not so much possibility to decide only for your state. All that makes people to a certain degree unhappy. And therefore populism, easy solutions, that people never really had looked very much in why this law or that law, like Switzerland or here. There was also in Switzerland populist movements to a certain degree on immigration, but that quietened down when it was solved more or less. And here there were also some, but not very much. And that, I think, is something that has somehow worried me for quite some time. That those states who are, in my opinion, to a certain degree over-centralized, are not fulfilling anymore the duties which are expected from the people, and that creates populism and easy solutions and things like this. And
well, the appeal of easy solutions. The appeal of easy solutions.
They appear easy solution, and very often they're catastrophes.
Yes. Narrowly avoided sometimes. Or not. Do you think increasing globalization, maybe is going to lead to more of this? Do you think this is something we're going to see continue, or do you think this is kind of something we're going to see fade away as people perhaps realize that, once we've elected a populace, they're not all they cracked up to be?
I don't think it's going to fade away, because globalization is going to increase. I think you have to adapt to this new situation. And really, the old nation state and socialist state told the people that we are going to produce heaven here on earth. And that doesn't turn out like that. And so there's a resentment on that, and the people have the feeling that the people up there, they don't are in contact anymore with us. They are detached. They are just looking for their own positions, their own money. And that creates this kind of populism. And that's, I think, a danger for democracy. And that worries me. That's one of the reasons why I wrote my book.
Yeah, it is worrying. I think that's probably
the
best way to describe it in a word.
Yeah, and I saw very early, I analyzed why have the colonial empires collapsed. It was for economic reasons, basically, political, but also economic. I saw the collapse of the Soviet Empire coming very early. I remember I was in the beginning, in the 80s or even earlier. I tried to tell the people in the White House whether they are prepared to that, this collapse is coming, and for economic reasons and so on. And no, they said it's going to last well over the year 2000.
Wow. It were
to be a mistake.
Yeah, they were not right on that one, even if it maybe served them.
So there I see also why has Yugoslavia collapsed? Why have other states are collapsing? Therefore, I thought with my book I would help to fix it. That there was the ideas I had. I remember I spoke with a representative of the Soviet Union. They had the right of self-determination on a republic, local republic way in the constitution. Of course, they didn't follow it. But I told them, don't put it on the republic way, break it down and introduce democracy from the bottom up. That's the only way how you're going to survive, save the Soviet Union. Because I thought if they would start to collapse, that would be a big mess.
Yes, definitely a big mess.
It remains a big mess. So luckily, it didn't break up. I was always afraid that it might break up either in a civil war fought out with atomic weapons, because they were dispersed in different places, or they would start World War III. Luckily, it turned out much better than I was afraid of.
Yeah, fortunately.
Yeah,
fortunately.
Thanks to Gorbachev, I have to say, to a large extent.
These questions I kind of put at the end because they're going to seem a bit like out of place, or I didn't really know where else to fit them into the interview. The first one, because you mentioned it in your book, it's been in the media for pretty much my entire life, has been the war on drugs.
Yeah. And
see how this is kind of a random tangent. How do you think that a government should treat drugs, the reality of drugs?
Of course, it's difficult questions to answer, or difficult problem to solve. Yeah. I try to approach it with a little bit of a market philosophy approach. Because what you can see is that the drug cartels and organized crime have huge profit margins by smuggling and producing those drugs. So my idea was really to cut out the profit margin and so to make it not profitable anymore. How do you do it without giving it free away? Which of course is not the solution, because then the whole population get drugged. So my idea was to say, okay, those people who are on drugs, they can consume their drugs in special places where they get clean drugs, where they can get advice how to get off the drugs, and that would cut out the profit margin of organized crime. Yeah. That was basically an approach of a free market economy. I don't even know if it was really my idea, if I haven't read it even before, someone American free market man who has thought of the same idea.
But either way, the way you talk about it, I think it highlights the problem not being necessary. While drugs in themselves as drugs are a problem because they can damage lives, the bigger evil there is the organized crime around it. And taking a market view rather than being like, let's make this as difficult as possible and push up the margins of the people who get it right, the drug cartels who work out how to get the drugs wherever they're going. Let's do completely the opposite and cut them out with economics. Yeah. It's just a question I had. I really liked your attitude towards it.
It's like when in the US they had the prohibition area.
Yes.
That created organized crime, basically.
Yep. That exists to this day.
And they survived thanks to the drug now. With alcohol, you are not going to make earn a lot of money anymore.
I think, there's already been so much damage done. There's already so many, I don't know, it seems there's cartels doing all sorts of terrible things to all sorts of people. And it's like, there were all sorts of bad things going on in Prohibition. Like you say, maybe if we change it now, maybe in 80 years we'll still be suffering, but maybe less.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, I have one more, which again is a bit of a random tangent, but it relates to another evil, I suppose, terrorism.
Yeah.
And that's with globalization, I suppose, we've been talking a lot about economic globalization, but there's also the whole world coming together in global threats, such as terrorism. And I think maybe Liechtenstein probably not a country
not the prime target for that.
But it is a global threat in a way, especially if you consider, second time we mentioned nuclear weapons this today, but these larger threats. What do you think a small state's, I don't want to say responsibility, but I want to say like involvement should be in something like this?
I think it's very important to have a very close cooperation with the larger states on all these difficult questions.
Yeah.
Which we have during the Cold War. Despite being a neutral country, also with the Americans, we got a lot of information that we provided information. That I think is the exchange of information is very important. So that I think is this cooperation I think is vital if you want to fight global terrorism or the drug war or God knows what. Yes.
Global cooperation to fight global threats, I suppose, in a way.
Yes, otherwise you have no chance.
It's interesting, the economic, the threats of globalization for populism economically, politically, the globalization and its benefits to globalization all throughout today. I want to say it's just been, I didn't know, I had a lot of questions and I've gone a little bit off script. So I just want to say it's been a real pleasure to ask you these and have you give me your thoughts on everything. Your Highness, it's been a pleasure.
It was an interesting discussion for me too.
I'm glad. Thank you very much.
Thank you.